This is a video explaining what I did on my build with the Holley Sniper EFI system, first gen. This is for a 95 GMC Sierra with the 2-barrel throttle body, which we'll get into about why I needed to keep the ECM and all that stuff. The big things with this setup is the wiring for sure, and particularly in my case is that I needed to keep the stock ECM harness to keep the AC control and the sensors in the front for the dash cluster to work. And since I'm running a 4L60E, I also needed to keep the stock harness to keep the speedometer gauge working on the dash. So the big thing with these Holleys for sure is the RFI signal, which is the interference of the new harness and the old harness, pretty much mixing signals and giving you false readings and all this weird stuff it will do. So when you do set yours up, I would take the extra time to shield the wiring from Holley, because Holley does not shield their wires. I've had to twist wires and buy these little isolator guys you see on the end of PCs and gaming controllers. They do help out a lot, and if you can, move the stock harness as far back as you can. Like right here, here's the stock one. That's all the essential ones that I had to run to keep the cluster from working. After you do that, that should alleviate a lot of the problems that I've seen on YouTube, and from personal experience is definitely the wire interference and all that. Another big thing too is the static timing. There's YouTube videos on how to set up your static timing, and with this build, my timing marks down there, kind of hard to see, but the timing marks only went up to about 12 degrees on the marks, and I needed 15 to run this hyperspark ignition. So there's videos on how to do the math calculations based on the diameter of your harmonic balancer and what distance you need to go from 0 degrees up to that 15 degrees to set it up properly. Then the other thing too is, especially with the wiring as well, that's the big one, is the wiring on these things. It's just one problem after another. The instructions out of the box are not the greatest, so I would recommend the bigger 90 PDF file that has like 90 pages of how to wire up things individually, because these are universal setups, so you kind of have to know what you're setting it up for to have it run good, because I ran into that problem. I was wiring it up the wrong way for what I was trying to do, where I was tying in this MSD box to a hyperspark to the Holley Sniper. And getting that set up properly is going to be a big thing too. And the TCM side of things, we'll go talk about that for a minute, but the TCM side of things, this is a OBD1 4L60E. This TCM module will work for OBD1 and OBD2 in 2009. The harness that you need is what's going to really depend on what you're working with. So for this example, OBD1, I needed the OBD1 harness for that module to work with my transmission I got in it now. The thing to the left of it is the throttle position sensor for the TCM that I currently have in this truck. This setup here, you can not run the Holley Sniper. You can do carburetor and still run your 4L60E on that. But with my setup, I have that first one doing the transmission throttle position sensor, and then you have your Holley Sniper throttle position sensor down there. So this one in particular is running 2. And I'd say another big gripe I've got about this thing is the display and configurations. You do, like I said, you got to get real specific with the configurations and all that. I did have a problem where I didn't have it in the 100% right settings, but another one too is that I had a bad O2 sensor. And with the Holley system compared to the MSD or OBD1 or OBD2 is that this system in the display will give you diagnosis codes, and everything else will. The OBD1 will give you flash codes. The OBD2, you hook up the scan tool, it gives you codes, and it kind of gives you an idea of where you're supposed to be sitting at on parameters and all that. The Holley Sniper does not. You need to really read the parameters, and then either get a hold of Holley or look at the manual and figure it out from there. Because my main problem with it was that since the O2 sensor was bad, it turned out that it also messed with the throttle output of this EFI system. So I was like starting it, idled great, all this great stuff, and then just absolutely no throttle at all. I'm like, what the heck, you know? You just get to a point where you're just done. You're like, I'm just go to a carburetor, da da da. I called them up, and they were like, oh, well, you need to go into your display and this, that, right? The problem with this, that is that we'll go over there and look at this, but pretty much the display doesn't always tell you what sensor does everything like everything else does. Like, you know, you plug in the OBD2 sensor, or you plug in the OBD2 scan tool, and it would tell you, okay, O2 sensor out of range. You know what I mean? And then with this TCM controller, it's got a diagnosis built into it. It tells you like calibration, okay, the circuit, you know, everything. If there's any slip detected, it would tell you. At least something to go off of, right? Like just a basics of something to go off of. But this system right here does not actually give you any hard codes. You have to really read these parameters, and when you do talk to the Holley techs, do remember all these percentages and all these parameters that they're going to ask for, because it will help out a lot with them helping you. And the Holley tech service is awesome. They really do know this system pretty well. So I would recommend talking to them if you run into problems with your system or however you want to set this up. But the O2 sensor story, it was dead pedal, had to call them up, and then in this stupid system, you know, you would think that it would say O2 sensor learn, or, you know, something relating to an O2 sensor, if you can look down that way, if you knew that sensor was bad. But like I said, this thing doesn't give you codes, so you don't even know where to start. You just know that the throttle doesn't work, so that could be a lot of things. You know, it could be the fuel, it could be mechanical, it could be the distributor, it could be a lot of things. But this thing was set up by a programmer, I'm pretty sure, not a car guy, because they call those things closed loop learns. And that is what messes with your O2 sensor. Instead of them labeling it O2 sensor. If they labeled it O2 sensor, you could have gone in there and disabled it. You would have, okay, all right, that's something to try. But I had to call them up, and they said, oh yeah, go into the closed loop and then disable the O2 sensor. As soon as I did that and got the throttle response back, put the O2 sensor in, we're good to go. You know, not a big deal, but it's just, I would say definitely keep Holley Tech Service phone number nearby, because this stuff is not as cut and dry as like other systems that I've personally dealt with. So yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents on that. If I was to do it again personally, I would do it, because I was trying to keep the 90s theme of throttle body injection in this truck in particular. But if you don't mind messing with the carburetor and, you know, dealing with that, then by all means, I would probably stick to that, honestly, because this thing was expensive compared to carburetor setup. There was a lot of things I had to do, and had to have a lot of patience to do it. There was a lot of phone calls about setting up everything correctly and measuring out things and setting hardware up and making sure the wiring's all good and there's not interference. And then the whole time about it too is this system is kind of the worst of both worlds, in my opinion, because with the mechanical diagnosing, you can kind of know, like you can kind of hear stuff and you can adjust it. Like if you had a distributor timing problem like I did, and that's because I just tried my best to measure it out and all that. With the old school distributor, you can sit there and twist it a little bit here and there and get it to act different. This one, if you don't disable the right setting in the thing, will mess with you, and it will throw you off, long story short. So you try to disable that, and then you try this, you try that, and it's one thing after another. So you can't really do the old school way of doing things sometimes. And then it also has a negative on the new school way of things, because the new school way of things already knows, okay, we got a bad O2 sensor here, but this thing does not tell you, hey, you need to look at this part of the circuit. It just throws a bunch of parameter numbers at you, and they assume you're going to know that right off the bat. You know what I mean? That's when you have to call the Holley guys, and you're like, oh, okay, that's what it's doing, yada, yada, yada. So I would say on that end of things, that's what I don't 100% like about it. It is more difficult to mess with, in my opinion, than your carburetors or your OBD2 stock stuff, or hell, even OBD1 stuff. And it's not like the technology is not out there. I mean, MSD did it with their transmission controller. They, your calibration, okay, your circuit, okay. They give you kind of just a general basis of things. But this thing, you have to read a lot of numbers, which, scary numbers, scary wires. I get that. But just, it would have been nice to know that. That's just my opinion on that. But yeah, in general, it's pretty good. Once it's all set up and everything, it's sweet. It's an awesome system. You just got to have the patience to deal with some wiring and understand these parameters and setting it all up. Like, there it goes. There's an O2 sensor. It's reading, look, that 12.4. So, and then when it warms up a little bit, it will go back up to more 13.5 where I have it set. But like I said, it runs great. It does do the job. It's just, you do got to be patient with the system. And if there are other problems with the truck, it will point it out to you really quick. And again, you'll just have to probably call Holley about a lot of this stuff with your build and everything you're dealing with. But I'd say it's a pretty good system. You just really got to be patient with it. But anywho, that's my 2 cents on it. You guys have a good day.